and we will be studying the subject that is written on the board before you, pride censured. Not censored, but censured, that is condemned. We do have others who are going away to school. Mark Pizzurro left this past week. Alex Sponseller will be going to school this week, or it's about this time that many began. Also, Kevin is going to be leaving us shortly. He will be going back to Alaska. I needed to give this some more thought. There are probably some others who are going to school, and we need to make note of that. And they certainly have our best wishes and our prayers that God be with them in this time. And those who are away from us, we will certainly look forward to their being back with us. Turn with me to Proverbs chapter 30. When we talk about pride being censured, that's the thread that runs throughout this amazing and sometimes puzzling chapter. We're going to study a lesson about what? Are we going to study a lesson about them? You know, all those prideful people. Well, if we look closely, we may get a glimpse of ourselves, and I hope that to our benefit. This text was written by really a humble and modest man, but he knows more than he realizes. And that was true of many of the prophets who wrote, and yet the spirit that was in them said things they did not understand. One of the things that will come out in these first few verses, of course, are his humility and his simplicity. But there are some amazing things there also. Begin with me, Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 2. Surely I am more brutish than any man, and have not the understanding of a man. As he looked about and he saw all the arrogance about him and all of the claiming of knowledge and understanding, he said, surely I am less than all of them. And in verse 3, and I have not learned wisdom, neither have I the knowledge of the Holy One. He's not saying he does not know God. He's saying, I do not have all the knowledge that God has. And then the questions that are asked may appear to be about man. He may have understood them as being of man, and yet I believe they are of God. Who hath ascended up into heaven and descended? Who has gone between heaven and earth? I don't think he knew what he was asking. Who hath gathered up the wind in his fists? Who hath bound up the waters in his garment? It may be referred to a man and of man's futility, and yet when you compare this to Isaiah the 40th chapter and how small the elements of the earth are compared to the power of God and the control that he has over them, this reminds you more of God and his power. And the answer to each of these questions would be, God has. Who hath bound up the waters in his garment? Who hath established all the ends of the earth? And then remarkably, this question. What is his name? And what is his son's name, if you know? So he says, I have not attained to the knowledge of God. And he remarks about someone ascending and descending, being ported back and forth between heaven and earth. And he mentions the one who's established the ends of the earth. It says, who is his name and who is his son's name? To me, that makes this a remarkable passage. Indicates the man knew more than he knew, or at least was saying more than he knew. And even though he was humble, he had his confidence in the right place. His confidence was not in himself. Look at verses 5 and 6. Every word of God is tried. It has been tried. It has stood the test of time. He is a shield unto them that take refuge in him. Add thou not unto his words, lest he reprove thee, and thou be found a liar. So his confidence is in the word of God, and his ambitions are simple, and they are appropriate. His first ambition, notice what it is for in verse 7. 2 things have I asked of thee, deny me them not. before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lies. His first ambition is truth. Then he says, give me neither poverty nor riches. Don't give me more than I can handle, and yet do not cause me to suffer, he prays. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me. Grant what I need, lest I be full. There's a temptation that goes with that. And he begins to introduce his subject of pride, which he has only hinted at earlier. Lest I be full and puffed up and deny thee and say, who is Jehovah? And that easily happens to a man when he has plenty and he has all that he needs. He no longer sees his need for God and ceases to be grateful. He thinks that he has accomplished it all on his own and all for himself. Lest I be full and deny thee and say, who is Jehovah? Or lest I be poor and steal and use profanely the name of my God. So a humble man whose confidence is in the right place, in the knowledge and wisdom of God, and whose ambitions are simple, first of all for the truth of God, and then for what is adequate in life. And after this, he begins to puncture folly, the folly of the proud, with many observations, first of all from nature. And he starts with the arrogance of some youth in their rebellion to the good things their parents would teach them. Then he goes to the arrogance and pride of blatant sinners. Then he expands his discussion to unworthy people in positions that are over their heads, positions they are not prepared for. And after that, he gives some advice and instruction to those of us who shall never reach the loftiest heights in life. And then he will close observing the nobility of some people who are in great position, who behave judiciously and considerately and unaffectedly. He anticipates really what Jesus said in Matthew the 23rd chapter in verse 12. Whosoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. And all of that can also derive from another thought in Proverbs, found in Proverbs 3, verse 34, and in James the 4th chapter in verse 6, as it is stated there. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This chapter censures pride. That is the thread that runs through it. It is not just a collection of fascinating, separate thoughts. Let's begin our reading now with verse 11 as he turns to the arrogance of unworthy offspring. And he says, there's a generation that curse their father and bless not their mother. They rebel. Incidentally, oftentimes young people today have help from that in schools, where they are told they need not accept the standards of their parents, that they have the right to establish their own standards. We have noted the folly of that. There are historians who have lived to be 70 and 80 years of age. They have that many years on this earth on their own. And besides in what they have studied, they have looked back over the centuries. And they puzzle at how life ought to be lived. And they can see some good things and they can see some bad things that grows out of all of that wisdom. But none of them are infallible. And with all of that experience and all of that knowledge, how foolish it is to say to a 16-year-old, you have the right and you have the ability to choose your own standards in life. There are young people who believe that at 13, 14, 15, 16, sometimes at 3 years old now, because many people have no idea what their rights are as parents or their responsibility as parents, what they ought to be teaching their children. And so there is rebellion. A generation that curses father will not bless mother. Incidentally, Marlene was marking recently about all of the wonderful things that such people as Abraham Lincoln wrote of his mother. All that I am and hope to be, I owe to my mother. And the song, M is for the many things, whatever, and oh, I don't even remember all of that song before. And all the poetry that has been written of mother and what mother is given. If you took the typical modern mother today, what beautiful things could you write of her? Oh, there are some sacrificing mothers today. There are mothers whose lives are terribly complicated, who try to do all they can for their children. I know that. But the ideal of mother is long gone, and it may be easier for many young people not to bless their mother. But he notes a problem. There is this kind of rebellion. And he says in verse 12, there's a generation that are pure in their own eyes. What have they done? They have chosen their own standards for life. They have chosen their own course, their own morality. And yet, what is the result of that? And yet are not washed from their filthiness. Just because you do what you think is right, just because you do what pleases you, does not mean that is the right thing to do. That does not mean you are justified in doing that. And that is one of the great misunderstandings about our culture today. Politically, we rejoice in our freedom of speech, our freedom of worship, and all the rest of the freedoms that are accorded us. But we have made one mistake in celebrating that freedom. We have assumed that exercising that freedom makes us all right and justifies us. But the writer here is indeed wise when he speaks of those who are pure in their own eyes and yet are not washed from their filthiness. They are not clean. What they chose was not good. Just choosing does not mean it is good. And in verse 13, there is a generation, oh, how lofty their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up. You see the pride there. You see the arrogance and the sentiment, no one can tell me anything. Do you know what the word supercilious means? Well, from what it sounds like, I think the definition is often missed. The cilious comes from the cilia, the hair, and the super being above or lifted up. So it is the raised eyebrow that is supercilious, that looks down arrogantly upon everyone else. That is what a supercilious person is, and that is what is being referred to here. And sadly, and how inappropriately, sometimes this is found in the young, who certainly have not that right, and they have not earned that place in life. This is not to discredit the young. This is not to admire the young. This is not to appreciate the idealism of the young. That is all there, but it is still a fact. They have not yet lived long enough to achieve the eminence so that they have the right to look down upon everyone else. Verse 14, there is a generation whose teeth are as swords and their jaw teeth as knives. And the allusion here goes back to a passage in Psalm 57 and verse 4 where it just speaks of utter selfishness, where there are people who consume everyone about them, destroy everyone about them for their own good and their own pleasure. And that's the idea. And you see that in the last part of the verse, to devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. We're dealing with the censure of pride, and his first target is a generation that cannot be told anything, that thinks it has the right to choose its own standards. That does not make them clean, and they become a generation of utter selfishness. We have an expression in our culture recently called ostentatious. That's ostentatious. Good. Ostentatious consumption. It is not enough just to make use of the things we have about us or to use the things we have. We have to flaunt. We have to go to the excess in our consumption. So you have a generation that selfishly thinks only of itself, consumes ostentatiously, sets its own standards, young people who will live at home and take the benefits of the home and want everything that the home can give to them and provide for them freely, and yet reject everything that home led by the parents stands for. That is arrogance and pride. And that is what the reader and the writer is dealing with here. And he compares it to something in verse 15 as he continues this thought of a prideful generation in youth. The horseleech hath two daughters, give. The word crying there, you notice, is in italics. There's nothing corresponding to that. And commentators were puzzled by this expression, daughters, and they wanted to refer it to the mouth mechanism of the leech, or perhaps the two-forked tongue that cried, give. But the word cried or crying is not there. What is the idea of daughter? Well, let me give you a quotation. This is from Geology Today, and it says, there is no mother-daughter sequence in the fossil record. Now, that may be surprising to you, and that's an entirely different subject, because the fossil record has been presented as the great evidence of evolution. But a geologist knows there is no mother-daughter relationship in the fossil record. There is no fossil that produced this fossil. There's no life form that has produced this life form that we can look at and see. We cannot find what has produced this. So when it calls and says, the horseleech hath two daughters, there are two things in association with it. There are two results of the leech. It is just give. Do you know what a leech is? It fastens its mouth onto another living creature, and here the horse, and just sucks blood. It sucks blood, and its existence is give. That's what he said about certain people in their youth. This is not a censure of youth, of all young people, but it is a censure of a certain kind of youth that will partake all the blessings of the home, not bless the mother, rebel against the father, reject everything the home stands for. How inappropriate. And the whole idea is, I am so important and I am so selfish. My existence is just give. That is, you give to me. And then he says, there are three things that are never satisfied, yea, four that are not enough, or say not enough. Proverbs uses that formula frequently. There are three, yea, four. There are six, yea, seven. And the idea is that while this is a specific list, it is not exhaustive. In other words, there are some other things also that are not satisfied, but in enumerating this way, he is showing the indefiniteness of it, even though he is dealing with some specific instances. Let me give you another example. Turn back to Proverbs, the 6th chapter, Proverbs 6, and let us begin with verse 16, where this formula is used again. Proverbs 6:16, there are six things which Jehovah hateth, yea, seven, which are an abomination unto him, haughty eyes, and a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked purposes, feet that are swift in running to mischief, a false witness that uttereth lies, and the seventh, and he that soweth discord among brethren. These are an abomination to Jehovah. Are these the only things that are an abomination to Jehovah? No. But here are six, yea, seven. There are other things you can find in the Word of God that are an abomination to God. And the idea is here there are some things that are never satisfied. And here are three, yea, four. The first one found in verse 16 is Sheol, or the grave, or death. Has death, as long as man been here upon this earth, ever been satisfied so that it says, no more, I am through, I will claim no one else? No, day by day, moment by moment, the grave continues to claim people. It remains unsatisfied. And the barren womb, this is not simply the womb that has not produced a child. This is the womb of one who desperately wants a child. such as Rachel in the Old Testament, who wanted a child so badly that she gave her handmaid as a wife to her husband to produce a child in her name. It is as Hannah, who was unable to have children, and she prayed at the temple, having been so abused by the other wives of Elkanah. The empty womb was not satisfied. It still cried for production. And he says this is one of the things that you find not satisfied. Sheol, the barren womb. Incidentally, how our standards have changed today. When in the past there was this tremendous desire to give life, to bring life that can be treasured and trained and made good into existence. And now things, pleasures, recreations are far more important than that. And so the lives are aborted and they are killed because they are inconvenient. Something that is inconvenient does not have high priority. It is not considered greatly important. And we are in trouble when we think that the production of life, that children are unimportant and do not have high priority. That is one of the sicknesses of our age. But three things, yea, four, never satisfied: the grave, the barren womb, the earth that is not satisfied with water. We've had a lot of rain, and it has done my roses a tremendous amount of good. But if we go another week without rain, those roses in that land and that earth are going to be crying, "Give me water." The earth is not satisfied. It must continually have water that must not cease. And it says, "And the fire that saith not, enough." Is fire ever satisfied? As long as there is something to consume, it will continue. It must run out of fuel to cease, or it must be put out. But as long as it may continue, it will continue. It will continue to consume. What's he talking about? He's talking about a generation that rebels against father, that will not bless mother, and yet take and grasp and demand everything that can be given unto them. And they are as insatiable as the grave, he is saying. But there is an end to that, and he brings it back in verse 17. This is Proverbs 30, verse 17. "The eye that mocketh at his father, and despiseth to obey his mother, the ravens of the valley shall pluck it out, and the young eagles," or quite literally, the vulture, "shall eat it." Here is his perception of what is right, what I want in life, my rights, and no one is going to interfere with them, no matter what my parents say. Now, there is some presumption here that the person has parents who are trying to teach them the godly statutes and teach them what is right in the eyes of God and what is in harmony with the eyes of God. And the young person says, "I will have none of that. Here are my perceptions." Those perceptions are going to be brought to naught just as vividly as if a raven plucked out your eye and a vulture ate it. One of these days, those standards and those aspirations will change. They will be destroyed. They will be shown to be that empty. That kind of rebellion leads to tremendous pain and disillusionment later on in life. He speaks here of the arrogance of unworthy offspring. You know, people have rebelled against parents. And later, when they have matured, they have seen the sense of what their parents were trying to say to them. They could not wait until they were on their own and then say, "You know, my parents were not right about this." But even while living at home saying, "Give, give," they rebelled. And it has brought them tremendous pain later in life. I have been at funerals, and I have seen the death of a mother or father. One of the great sources of pain, those that were left behind, is they had rebelled and it was too late to say, I am sorry. And mother, you were right. And daddy, I really do know you love me. That's the idea in this picture. The perceptions are going to be changed and destroyed that are in arrogant youth who can only cry, give, give. That's one element of pride he deals with. But let us go now to verse 18, where he looks at the arrogance that hides sin. The wicked, the arrogant wicked, who will not recognize their sin. We live in a day like that today. Here we are now, ready to begin with verse 13, Proverbs 30. There are three things which are too wonderful for me, yea, four, which I know not. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent upon a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a maiden. And how does that compare to the way of an eagle, the way of a serpent, the way of a ship? And verse 20, so is the way of an adulterous woman. She eateth and wipeth her mouth and saith, I have done no wickedness. That is a puzzling passage. I think the key in it is to notice very carefully what he is saying. He says, yes, there are some things that are too wonderful for me, but about them he says, I know not. What does he not know? He does not know the way, the path, the course of the eagle in the air. There was the eagle. The eagle has flown down, caught a fish, and now is on the cliff and on the limb of a tree. And he cannot see that path that was there. He knows that it took place, but he does not know that course. He does not know that path. It is not visible to him. And likewise, the serpent upon the rock. There's the serpent. There's the rock that he came across. Where is the path of the serpent? The course of the serpent. He does not know that course. He does not see it. It is not visible to him. And the way of the ship in the midst of the sea, the ship was at shore. It is now in the midst of the sea. It got there through some course, some path, some way. I cannot see that in the midst of the sea. It is gone. It is not visible to me. And then he says, and the way of a man with a maiden. Some have supposed that this is the seduction of the young woman. I do not believe that is so, because it is said with some awe, certainly with nothing negative, and then in the next verse blasts the adulteress. So I cannot think that he is talking here about a man seducing a young woman into immorality and just says it casually with some fascination and then speaks to the adulteress. Now that would really be a double standard, and I don't believe you have that here. Well, what does he say? In the way of a man with a maiden. What is it? I don't understand this. What is it about a man that attracts the young maiden, that causes her to feel that she just must have? Now, on the other hand, I can see what attracts men to women. That's easy for me to understand. But what attracts women to men, I don't know. Have you ever heard anybody look at a couple and say, what does she see in him? They don't see the way of the man with the maiden. They don't see those things that have appealed to her, that made her heart skip a beat or maybe beat a little faster, that caused everything in her to say, I must have him. And the rest of the women didn't say that about him, but this one did. And it is puzzling. And he does not see the way of that man with that maiden any more than he sees the path of the snake on the rock, the course of the ship in the sea, or the path of the flight of an eagle. Now, look at the next verse, verse 20. So is the way of an adulteress, and it is the way, the course of the adulterous woman. She eateth and wipeth her mouth. One picture is she sees no more in her sexual follies than or her sexual activity than just eating a meal. She eats and wipes her mouth. She has her activity and goes about then her responsibilities in life. But after doing that, she says, I have done no wickedness. Now, just because she does not see her wickedness does not mean it is not there. Just because I do not see the path that the eagle took and it is not still outlined in the air, just because I cannot see the course that the snake crawled across the rock does not mean it is not there. Just because I cannot still see the course that the ship took in the waters does not mean that there was no course, there was no path, there was no way there. There has to be. The ship is there. It started here. There had to be a path there even though I do not see it. And even though I do not see those things, they are there. Even though I do not see what in this man attracts this woman, it is there. And even though the adulteress does not see her sin, it is there. It is her pride and her arrogance and her uncaringness that causes her not to see her sin. But it is there. You know, we live in an age that looks casually at sexual intercourse between unmarried people. It has actually been taught in our universities. You know, sexual intercourse is to this adulteress as just eating and wiping her mouth. And it has been taught in our universities that there is nothing more about sexual intercourse than there is in shaking hands. I know that. I've heard it from various sources. And I remember a few years ago talking to a very intelligent young woman who had been classically educated in one of our universities today, and in her social studies courses and philosophy courses and ethics courses. That's what she had been taught. Well, I think anybody with any common sense at all can see a difference. And first of all, shaking hands does not stir and bind people in compelling passion. Shaking hands does not produce life. Shaking hands does not bring into existence sexually transmitted diseases. Sexual intercourse does not break up marriages. Oh, no. Shaking hands does not break up marriages. Sexual intercourse with somebody besides one's mate does. I just get beside myself when there are people who are supposedly intelligent and brilliant and who are training our young, and they have been to school professionally year after year after year, who can say there is nothing more significant about sexual intercourse than shaking hands. In the first place, I feel awfully sorry for them if they think there's that much comparison. And in the second place, they are just as wrong as they can possibly be. But you see, that was anticipated back here by the writer who looked at the adulterous woman, and she says, I have not done anything significant. I have done no wickedness, whether she sees it or not. It is there, as surely as the course of the ship upon the waters. But the bottom line about adultery or fornication is that God has not said, thou shalt not shake hands. But he has said in Galatians, the 15th chapter, in verses 19 through 21, for the fornicator and the adulterer, and then he mentions a list of other sins, and those who do these and such like, they shall not inherit the kingdom of God. And in Revelation 21 in verse 8, but for the fearful and unbelieving and abominable and murderer and fornicator and sorcerer and idolater and all liars, their part shall be in the lake that burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. God has not said that about shaking hands. From this, he passes to the paradox of pride, the pride of unworthy people in places of advantage. Look at the text beginning in verse 21. For three things the earth doth tremble, and four which it cannot bear. When he uses the word earth here, it is metonymy. It is speaking of the people in the earth. There's a passage, for instance, in Amos 7 and verse 11, where a priest writes to Jeroboam about the terrible things Amos is prophesying against Jeroboam, and he says, the land cannot bear the words of Amos. Well, he's not talking about the dirt. He's talking about the people who live upon the land. And when the earth cannot bear what are these things, the earth? What is it that is so difficult for us to bear about some people, about some prideful, arrogant people? Verse 22, for a servant when he is king, a fool when he is filled with food, for an odious woman when she is married, and a handmaid that is heir to her mistress. Here is the servant. He is not prepared for nobility. He does not have the character to enable him to exert authority and do it judiciously and fairly, and the earth cannot bear him. He is a servant who has the mentality of the servant. He has never learned great responsibility on his own. He is always done only what he is told to do. Now, this is not to say that every servant is incompetent, but it is simply proverbial in the past, and one can still recognize it. There are people who do not have the character to rule, to reign, to govern. And when they are put in places like that, it is something that the earth trembles at and cannot bear. Kind of a different issue, but I remember when Bear Bryant used to coach the University of Alabama football team. And it was in an era that started something that is still going on. The football player crosses the goal line into the end zone, and he takes the football and he spikes it, and he jumps up and down and he dances all around and acts generally like a fool. And so his players were doing that too, and he called them in a meeting. He says, look, I want this stuff to stop. When you cross that goal line, you hand the ball to the official and act like you have been there before. And that meant something to his team, and it was saying, when these other guys do that, maybe they've got it right. Maybe that's the first touchdown their team ever scored. Well, okay, let them act like it. But when you score, act like you've been there before. And there are some people who reach positions of rule, and they can't act like they've been there before. It is totally opposite to their nature. They don't know anything about it. And that's what he speaks of here about the servant when he is king, and the fool when he is filled with food. The earth has a difficult time tolerating him. Here's the fool. He knows some prosperity. He is eating well now. What does he do? Does he continue his activity so he will eat well tomorrow, so he can support his family tomorrow? No, whatever he has his hands on, he will spend. I recently heard a man say, well, not recently, it was many months ago now, but he said, I've never had enough money. Whatever I have, I spend. Yes, and that becomes an affliction for others about him and those who are concerned about him. The fool, when he is full, is difficult to tolerate because in his pride, he thinks now he has it all, he has everything he needs, and he does not go ahead and make preparations for tomorrow. For an odious woman when she is married, and there's much in this idea of odious, of foolishness, of a personally unattractive woman who has longed to be married, and now that she is married, she makes everyone else around her miserably. She uses her advantage hatefully. She puffs herself up. She places herself higher than the rest of those who are not yet married. So you see the person, unattractive. No one pays any attention to them. They feel so sorry for themselves. And then for some reason, someone, for whatever reason, marries her. And now in her pride and her arrogance, she looks down upon everyone else. And there you have again this element of pride. And a handmaid that is heir to her mistress. The handmaid, and now she is heir to her mistress and inherits all of that. Have you ever heard the thing that sometimes parents tell their children? I want you to grow up to be someone. Well, if that parent is talking about character, That's a wonderful thing to teach children. I want you to grow up to be this kind of person. I want you to be someone that people can admire for your good qualities. I want you to be fair. I want you to be honorable. That's what I want you to grow up to be. Sometimes there are people who are raised in disadvantaged circumstances, and they are told, you must grow up and be someone. And what is being instilled there is not a good kind of pride, but a very false kind of pride. And they spend their lives trying to be someone. They will walk over you. They will do anything they have to do to be someone. The earth cannot tolerate, cannot stand that kind of person. And yet it is full of that kind of people. So he continues his censure of pride. The servant who becomes king, the fool when he is filled, the odious woman when she is married, and the handmaid that is heir to her mistress. But from that, he talks now to the rest of us who are not going to reach these lofty heights of eminence. And he says something very important to us. You don't have to accomplish something in life. There are 4 things which are little upon the earth, but they are exceeding wise. The ants are people not strong, yet they provide their food in the summer. So industry, patience will get your work done here upon this earth. You do not have to be strong. You do not have to be big. You do not have to achieve the heights of eminence, industry, patience, as the ant will do it. The conies, and this is a little animal like a guinea pig. The conies are but a feeble folk, yet make they their houses in the rocks. Even though they are weak and they have not great strength, they achieve strength through wise choices, where they have built their houses. And if we can go along with industry and patience and apply some wisdom, we likewise can succeed. And it says about the locusts have no king, yet they go forth, all of them by bands. Now, whether you like the effect of locusts or not, they are effective. They can start on one side of a corn crop, and when they leave, it is devastated, or a wheat field. There is no king that has ordered them or organized them. They simply cooperate. The principle of cooperation. And in verse 28, the lizard taketh hold with her hands, yet she is in kings' palaces. Just quiet, hanging on. You have to crawl up the wall and just sit there very quietly. When you get a chance, you can move. When you get a chance, you can move again. Pretty soon, you may be in kings' palaces. So it says then, industry, patience, wise choices, cooperation, the ability to simply hang on quietly. With these qualities, you can accomplish much. And you don't need this idea, I've got to be someone in life, and be filled with arrogance and pride and rebellion that will destroy you, bring you unhappiness, and cause the people around you to have the inability to even tolerate you. But a couple of more thoughts in closing out this text. Let us start with verse 29. He now turns to true dignity, to those who have the ability to exercise their responsibilities without flaunting them. He says in verse 29, there are 3 things which are stately in their march, yea, 4 which are stately in going. The lion, which is the mightiest among the beasts. And you look at a lion in the zoo and then go over to the monkey house. And you watch the monkeys jumping around all over and trying to get attention. And you see the lion who just stands there in stately fashion. In his strength and in his character, he does not need to cavort and jump around and squeal like the monkey. And it says then, and the greyhound, the he-goat also. And you picture a greyhound as they're just usually pictured, or you see them in photographs, sitting there in great dignity. And on the other hand, you watch the yipping, yapping puppy. The puppy has something to yip and to yap about and trying to get attention. The greyhound, the German name for it is windhound, as swift as the wind. His reputation is established. He doesn't need to flaunt it. The puppy needs to do something to get attention. And there is the he-goat standing on his high perch. He's not crowing and strutting about like the rooster. He is stately, as is the greyhound and the lion. And then he makes another application and says, the king, against whom there is no rising up. Here's the benevolent king, unoppressive. He does not flaunt his power. He does not have to go to extreme measures to impress it upon other people. It is there, and he has a dignity that is recognized, and his people love him. He does not oppress them, and thus they do not rise up against him. We live in an age that says, if you have it, flaunt it. That's pride. This person says there is something that far surpasses that. If you have it, exercise it in the stately manner of the lion, the greyhound, the he-goat or the mountain goat, and the king against whom there is no rising up. I want you to picture two pretty girls. One is dressed in the fashion of a prostitute. And that's really right. You can go to shopping centers and sometimes to church and find people dressed that way. There she is in her mini skirt, in her extreme makeup. What is she doing? She is flaunting it. Here's another lovely young lady, and she is dressed modestly, attractively. The beauty is there. She stands there in stately attire and manner, just as the lion, the king against whom there is no rising up. The other feels some insufficiency, like the servant who is made king, who is not prepared for that position. Somehow she is not prepared for the beauty that she has, and she feels the necessity of flaunting it. And even now, the short skirt is becoming passé. It will be worn for some time because there are women who feel, in order to feel worthy and to attract attention, they must do that. They are unworthy people in the high position of possessing a beauty they do not deserve. Flaunting it is pride and leads to all sorts of hurtful things to the person and those around. Rather, be like the stately characters that are mentioned here in this latter text. And finally, to verse 32. If thou hast done foolishly in lifting up thyself, or if thou hast thought evil